Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon. I think I can speak for all of the panelists to say that this Tucson Festival of Books is quite awesome. The energy that there's just a terrific energy that the authors need and feel and thank you for. I think you could say that for probably half of the panels at this festival, the title could be Orwell Was Right. This panel is actually called Can Truth Survive Fake News? The very phrase of which, fake news, is of course fake itself, coined by a bottomless Pinocchio, who by my colleague Glenn Kessler's count has uttered more than 8,700 false or misleading claims. But we have a great panel to discuss the search for truth in its meeting today, starting with, to my far left, Nina Burleigh, a great writer, correspondent for Newsweek, formerly of People magazine, and a prolific author who has written about everything ranging from Middle Eastern archaeology to the Amanda Knox trial in Italy. And her latest book, which I have to be careful with because the first word is golden, and it's about Trump, but it's actually Golden Handcuffs. And it's about the Trump women. To my immediate left is Rick Wilson, who I'm sure everyone who watches MSNBC knows by now.
Thank you.
A Republican campaign operative for many years, and probably the ultimate never, ever, ever Trumper. A conservative whose mug has gotten millions of liberals excited to see him on TV with his brilliantly lacerating takedowns of the president and his cult. And his book, of course, is called Everything Trump Touches Dies. And Trump has never touched me, thank God. Literally. And in the middle, I'm honored to present David McCraw, a great First Amendment lawyer for the New York Times, who has been in the trenches fighting for press freedom at the Times since 2002, and before that at the Daily News, I believe.
That's right.
And his book, which has just come out and is for sale here, even though I think the pub date was March 12th, he pushed it up. And it's, I consider it quite a really well-written, self-deprecating, illuminating look at what it's like, the hard work that goes into the stories that David and the lawyers try to protect inside the New York Times.
Thank you.
And I'm going to start with David because there was one sentence in his book that got me thinking and contrasting it with Rick and Nina, where he's talking about the immediate hours and days after the election in 2016. And he says, I was wrong about Trump for much too long. And he's talking there about Trump's danger to freedom of the press. And David, I want you to explain why you were wrong and why you think you were wrong.
Can't we start someplace else? I mean, couldn't you point out this is the largest crowd ever? No, sorry. Those aren't empty seats. Those aren't empty seats.
Well, I have photos of my crowd.
So
There are at least 7,000 people in this room.
That line and one of the opening chapters of the book start looking at what I call myself as the raving moderate. I'm an optimist by nature. I thought that the campaign had been the campaign and that we would then get back to something that looked a little bit like normal. People were recruiting me to join various campaigns to take on Trump, to fight against change in law and so forth. In the middle of that, Trump came to the New York Times, and there was this really interesting event at the end of that where he's been speaking for about 50 minutes with our editors, and somebody asked him about the free press and whether he was really serious about trying to change the law, which would be very hard for the president to do. And he said, you know, I raised that with somebody, and then this person pointed out that it would be easier for people to sue me. And so I think you're going to be okay. Nobody thought we were going to be okay. I don't think any of us thought we were going to be quite in the place that we are. And the point I'll make very briefly, maybe come back to later, is that I'm still not that concerned about change in law. Clarence Thomas, a couple of weeks ago, talked about rolling back Times versus Sullivan, the seminal libel decision by the Supreme Court in this country. But I'm much more concerned about the effort to delegitimize the press, to encourage people to think of the press as a stain on America, as the enemy of the people, as a purveyor of fake news. And I've done a lot of work overseas with free speech groups, and the thing you learn there is that a distrusted press and a shackled press aren't that far apart. If you cannot move public opinion, you cannot operate in a free society. You cannot move people to protest scandal. You can't move people to stand up to government when it's wrong. And that's why the discrediting is so deadly to democracy.
Nobody has shackled Rick Wilson, of course, but I was struck by another chapter in your book on the media, where you say that conservatives waged war on the media for decades, and the media won. How do you explain that with Fox News and everything that's going on today?
We're actually in a golden age of journalism right now. There is greater investigative reporting going on right now than at any point, I would argue, since Watergate. That doesn't mean that the media is not under a nearly existential threat by the division in the society that we're in right now, which we are siloed into these two big media pools. And you've got the most brilliant creation of Roger Ailes, who was a genius at television. Whether you love or hate Roger, you have to acknowledge Roger was a genius at creating television. He built the machine that holds Donald Trump aloft in our society today. Fox News reaches 90 million Americans. That's a lot. That's a lot of eyeballs every day. They are the dominant cable force in the country. That doesn't mean that they're not, that they're completely able to set the agenda for the whole country. They are a constant drip feed of fear for a lot of the Trump base. They're a constant pressure upward on Trump's numbers for the Republican base and an enforcement mechanism. But we do have a press right now that understands sometimes it has to get in the fight to preserve its role in our society and to preserve itself as an institution when it's under a withering attack by a man who holds the free press in utter contempt. And the irony of my Republican colleagues is many of them declare themselves to be strict constitutionalists. And, you know, as a actual strict constitutionalist, yeah, I'm a big fan of the Second Amendment too, but it's not the only one I look at. And the First Amendment matters, and it matters probably more than the rest, not just because of its ordinal position, but because of the importance of having accountability mechanisms in our society. And one of the most important is a free and frankly, sometimes confrontational press. Our founders didn't exist in an era of state-run media in the tone of Fox. They had a variety of, frankly, partisan press outlets that all waged war on each other and all competed to have messages and competed to have news pushed out there. And right now, we are in a good era in some ways because the media is energized and they're in a fight. And they know they're in a fight and they can't be complacent. And they're also in an era where they've got opportunities they rarely have with most White Houses. Most White Houses, good ones, leak on purpose. This White House leaks because it's not a good one. It leaks all the time. They're all in this Darwinian battle inside the Trump White House of who's gonna be the last person to be humiliated and thrown out the door. It's like the worst apprentice ever. So that's sort of the 30,000-foot view of where we're at in terms of, I think, the challenge and the opportunity for the press right now.
I think that applies to the national press and especially some of the larger papers, and the dangers of local coverage and state house coverage is still very much vulnerable.
On the economic, economic model side, that's a whole.
Sure. Yes. Nina, you have faced face-to-face the dark side of an attempt to repress the exploration of truth, related to your book, but not exactly the book. Can you explain what happened to you and how that's affected your perspective?
Yeah, well, I'd just like to start by saying I'll read you a quote from Ivanka Trump, because my book is about the women of Trump. And one of her, she wrote a book early before he ran for office, and she is her father's daughter. The quote is, "Perception is more important than reality. If someone perceives something to be true, it is more important than if it is in fact true. This doesn't mean you should be duplicitous or deceitful, but don't go out of your way to correct a false assumption if it plays to your advantage." So that's kind of what we're up against, among many things. So what David's referring to is I wrote my book about the Trump women, the three wives, Ivanka and Trump's mother and grandmother. It was assigned by Simon & Schuster, based on a magazine article that I did right after the inauguration about the women of Trump. And when they offered me the contract, my immediate, I dragged my feet for a long time, because having covered Trump, having lived in New York, having watched how he operates, having read the biographies, I knew that his habit of litigious, his litigious responses, his willingness to file lawsuits, as frivolous and as losing as they might be, was a scary thing to confront. I know somebody who was involved in one, a writer, and it's not a pleasant thing to have to deal with. So I was reluctant to start it, and then when I did start it, I made a decision not to put things in it that were not entirely nailed down, with sources double-checked. We had lawyers go through it, for months before it came out. Even though my editor would have loved to have something in there that would have drawn down the kind of attention that Michael Wolff's book, I assume everybody here is familiar with Michael Wolff's book. It's sort of the text on the Trump White House. Because to do a book like that, you are guaranteed what is now, today, the Oprah's Book Club stamp of approval, which is the Trump rage tweet. And for publishing, that's what you want. But I avoided all of that. I hewed to things that had already been published, or hewed to things that had 100% corroboration. And the book came out in October, to absolute silence from the Trump administration and the right-wing press, which was kind of interesting. It was completely ignored. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I think that they really didn't want to give it any attention at all. And 3 or 4 months passed. The London Telegraph contacted me and asked me if I wanted to write an article about it, about Melania, and using some of the material in the book and doing a little bit more reporting. So I wrote a piece over Christmas, and it went up. And they sent me a letter a week after it came up and said, "We've received a letter from Charles Harder. Charles Harder is Melania Trump's attorney. Charles Harder has gotten $3 million out of the Daily Mail already. Charles Harder brought down an entire media company in New York over the Hulk Hogan video, and he's a fearsome character." The Telegraph immediately retracted, took the story offline, and that was fine. And then they moved to write an apology, which is sort of, they said, they called and they said, we're gonna have to apologize. We really want this to go away. And they put out an apology letter, and they said, we're not going to use your name. Well, everybody in the world knew. It didn't take long to figure out whose story it was. And they took it down with this apology, and it was abject. And it apologized for things that other journalists have written about her, and it apologized for things that are factually accurate. And then they said they gave her a substantial sum, which I understand to be probably in the low 5 figures, probably just legal fees. But it was a real stain on, of course, my reputation and my project. So I had to get a lawyer in London to counter all of these claims officially, and that's online. And the question is now whether or not one goes to court to win back one's reputation. And I'm not a litigious person. I like that my story is out there, my side of the story, and I think that's probably where it ends, but I don't know. We may go further. The lawyers think they have a case. But the point of it is, you know, when you're writing about these people, that is always a threat. And I think that's where I'll leave that for now.
You know, Nina, the fun part about that is if you did go to that, you'd get her NDA in discovery.
Yes, well, there, you know, that is. I mean, the idea of getting her into discovery, of course, is
which is where Trump always folds, by the way, when it comes to lawsuits.
Right. I mean, the British law is much different than ours, and that is why they caved in so quickly, because they might not even get to NDA. You know, they might not get to discovery. So, but it's still under discussion. Stay tuned. It could get interesting.
David, you've dealt with these very same lawyers for pressuring the New York Times for Trump even before he was elected. And why don't you explain that, and also a little bit about why you're more protected in the U.S. than Nina faced in England?
Okay, I'm going to try not to lapse into professor mode here. Exactly right, that the U.S. laws have been a godsend to democracy. We should stand up for them. You know, the heart of the libel law in this country was set forth in Times versus Sullivan, 1964, where it began this revolution where the Supreme Court said, even if the story is wrong, the publisher can still win as long as the publisher didn't have actual malice, reckless disregard of the truth. And to think about it in a very simple way, that if you believe what you're writing is true, you have no reason to have any sort of substantial doubt about it, you're still protected even if something goes wrong. And it has been a blessing for the press. It's allowed the press to do incredible things in this country. And one of the things that I think is really important to keep in mind is that when the Supreme Court ruled in Times versus Sullivan in 1964, it essentially was saying, be courageous, do tough stories, go after people in power, know that you're going to be protected by the law. And I, as a lawyer, think it is a betrayal of that law, and a betrayal of what Justice Brennan and the Supreme Court was doing if I take the position that we should be scared. I want to help our people get things published. That's always been what we're about as lawyers at the New York Times. I'm lucky to work at the Times in that we have long taken the position that we will not settle libel cases for money in the United States. Actually goes back long before Times versus Sullivan. I was doing an article about this for the Times last year, and there's this 1922, I think it is, but from the 1920s letter from our publisher, then publisher, who I believe is the great-great-grandfather of our current publisher, but I may have missed a great in there. And it's a remarkable document because a lawyer has written to him saying, a lawyer for the New York Times, saying, we're going to settle this case upstate New York. And the publisher writes back and says, you know my feelings about this. Do not pay money to settle libel cases. If we got it wrong, we'll hear that from a court and we'll pay whatever the court says we should. But we're not going to simply settle to make the problem go away. Our commitment to our journalists, our journalism is that strong. And so it's easier for me than it is for a lot of my colleagues elsewhere because I always know the answer when somebody asks, should we settle? And because the answer is going to be no if they're asking for money. But Nina's correct that England plays by very different rules. One of the things that is true in England is that the publisher, the author, has to prove something is true. It's just the reverse in the United States that in this country, the plaintiff has to prove that it's false. Huge difference. We were sued in England by somebody who had been a hanger-on with the Beatles in 1967. The article had been a bit of a reprise of what happened in 1967. We suddenly found ourselves trying to find people from 1967 who, A, remembered what had happened, B, had not smoked so much dope that they had some shot of remembering it, and 3, were many times deaf from having sat through too many rock concerts. So anyway, it was a tough lift for us. But the thing I want to end with is that because of the way foreign law makes it easier for people to sue, Congress took an extraordinary step in 2010. They passed the U.S. Speech Act. What the U.S. Speech Act says is that if somebody wins a libel judgment overseas in a country that isn't as protective of the free press as the United States is, that person cannot bring that judgment to the United States and enforce it. Cannot come here and get bank accounts, cannot come here and make a levy against properties. Incredibly powerful law to stop what was going on, which was people were suing overseas and coming to the United States to enforce it. Here's the important thing to remember about the Speech Act, since most of you, I assume, are not going to get sued for defamation overseas. The important thing is this, is that every Republican and every Democrat voted for that bill. Every one of them. That was in 2010. That's the consensus we need to get back to, that the free press matters.
Rick, I spent the year 1995 writing about Newt Gingrich and the Republican Revolution, and in some ways consider that to be a progenitor of what's going on today. And I, without making you be self-deprecating like David, you know, what did you see that this monster was being created then, and what sort of role do you feel responsible for yourself as part of that?
I think the moment where I started to have a kind of like, is this thing out of the fence at this point, was during the 2010 cycle, where suddenly we were seeing, you know, Sarah Palin promoting primary candidates who were crazy as a sprayed roach and who were just not ready for prime time. Because the Long March, and even Gingrich was smart about this, he understood that while the contract with America was a great branding mechanism, remember Newt's pickups in '94, a lot of those people were not running on some particularly ideological platform, they were running as reformers. He also left some flexibility for local candidates, local parties to say, you know, this guy's a better fit for this district than this other guy. He may not be every ideological dream date, but, you know, he can win. So Newt had a little, there was a little practicality in it, but it certainly set the seeds of something that has become sort of a defining characteristic of Trumpian conservatism, and that is this sense of inferiority about the media. They're out to get us. They always lie. They are always mean to us. They're always saying we're stupid or slow or bigoted. And that has becomes this tribal signaling mechanism inside the Republican Party where, you know, in the era of Trump, it doesn't matter what you think about debt and deficit or individual liberty or property rights or foreign policy. The big tests are twofold. One, do you love the great leader Donald Trump with all your heart and soul, and will you sacrifice everything for him? Two, do you hate the press? And Trump has recognized very clearly, embedded in all this statist, nationalist, authoritarian stuff he flirts with all the time, is he's got to drive a wedge between his base and objective truth and reporting. And they hate the thought that the president's words and actions and deeds will be reported accurately and he will be held to account. That disturbs them tremendously. But we started to see that bifurcation, I think. You know, look, Fox was launched in '96. Talk radio really took a big upsurge in the mid-'90s, early and mid-'90s. And social media started to really sweep in as a political factor around 2010 to 2012. And these things started to have a sort of singularity of you know, this siloing effect with the Republican base vote particularly, where this sense of inferiority and paranoia about the media and about institutions more broadly, this echo chamber telling them all the time, be afraid. Are you not afraid yet? Because the brown people are coming to get you, whether it's the Muslims or the caravan or MS-13 or whatever, you know, whatever monster du jour came out of Bill Shine's brain for the last 15 years. So those things, they sort of all swept together and made this perfect storm in 2016 that led us, I think, to the point where we are. And of course, the catalyst in all that was you had a guy who is morally reprehensible and as intellectually bankrupt as he is. Donald Trump has a tremendous feral cunning about the media and understands how to play it and manipulate it and use it and how to turn it as a weapon to keep his base ginned up all the time.
You know, I'd like to take like a 3-minute break here to go to Nina and just clear your minds of Trump for 3 minutes, because I wanted to talk about something else, which is your reporting on Amanda Knox was really groundbreaking. And I'd love you to talk about what lessons you learned about assumptions of fact and your search for truth and trying to figure out that story, which had so much mythology built up around it.
I would like to answer that, but can I just follow up
Sure,
on
of
what
course.
what Rick just said? Because
Don't hold
it's
off on
really,
Trump yet.
It's really important. I started in this business in the 1980s covering the State House in Illinois. And the State House, are people from Illinois in here? A lot of snowbirds.
Here we go.
And that State House in that press room was filled. Every little Warren, every office, every square inch of it had journalists in it, because there were that many newspapers and that many radio stations and that many outlets in the state of Illinois, downstate, upstate, telling Americans what's going on in one of the most corrupt state capitals. I mean, I guess they all are, but
No,
I
I'm
mean,
from
I
Florida.
learned
I'll see and raise you on
everything
that
I
one.
needed. Okay, now maybe
I've got New
I
Jersey.
learned everything I needed to know about American politics in Springfield, Illinois in those years. Now, in my life, so I'm totally disagreeing with Rick on the golden age thing. In my lifetime, I don't have the figures, I used to have them, but the numbers of journalists in this, the people who are actually working at what I do, has collapsed and plummeted. I know people who are selling hot dogs in Detroit who used to work for the Chicago Tribune. The industry has collapsed. My company, the place I work, hanging on by its fingernails financially. And all of this happened at a time when we now have a president and a regime running this country that has singled out journalists by name, by tweet, from the Oval Office, in rallies with 10 or 15 or 20 times more people in them than you right here, howling at them and howling memes, lying memes over and over. And those of us who are supposed to tell people what's going on in your state house or in the White House, we're drowned out. I have Twitter feed, we all, everybody has to tweet back. We write, of course we have the megaphone. You can get on TV and you can say things, but the megaphones are siloed. The TV is all siloed. So this is all to say, as somebody who's my whole training was to cover and believe in the fact that there was a public looking for the objective as opposed to the subjective. Over the 2 years that I've been covering Trump, in the beginning, that kind of quote from Ivanka Trump was sort of a joke to me, and this whole thing was sort of, oh, it's just going to be quite an interesting thing to cover. It's ridiculous. And this last summer, I started to really understand and feel how degrading it is to the profession. I don't mean degrading like bringing us down to lie in the ground lie down with dogs and come up with fleas, although that's part of it. But just the degradation, the dissolving of what we do, and it is not the golden age of journalism. And I have to.
I take your point on that though, because
I wish it was. I know people
and
are
I think
working very hard.
I think David's point about my observation is correct. That I am talking about the Times, the Post, that are playing at this very high level with this incredible degree of access right now and incredible scoops right now. But yeah, I mean, your example, when I started out in politics in Florida in 1988, there were about 60 reporters covering politics in the state, and now there are about 5. I kid you not, about 5.
I'm sure that's true here in Arizona.
And they're stretched.
Yeah.
They're stretched to the absolute outer boundaries all the time. They miss enormous stories all the time. And no, there is no social media component where bloggers are going to fill the gap between that and actual journalism. It just doesn't happen.
Can I break the gold age ice age tie here?
Please.
Okay, yeah. It is the ice age for local journalism. If as somebody said the other day, if your ambition is to steal a lot of money through politics, now's the time to run for office because your local newspaper is not there to care anymore. I agree with Rick that, though, at the other end, the coverage of Washington Washington has really been superlative. We feel it at the Times. The pressure that we feel from the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, other outlets to cover the big story is there. The last thing I would just say, and not in defense of Illinois, but to underscore it, is I grew up in Illinois. I grew up in a small farm town in Illinois. Every governor when I was a kid went to jail. That's right. Otto Kerner went to jail. Dan Walker went to jail. Even Fat Sam Shapiro went to jail. They all went to jail.
Right.
I took away from that one lesson: you can't trust people in government. I don't understand where the conservatives have gone. That used to be the conservative ethos. Don't trust these people. And
skepticism of executive and state power used to be a core function
Exactly.
of conservatism. It was that the power of the state had to be constrained, the power of the executive had to be constrained. I mean, I remember when Republicans were declaring that Barack Obama was like Black Stalin because he was doing executive orders. They were freaking out. And Trump does it now as his central mode of governance. And conservatives are like, yeah, all right, that's cool.
But I want to hear about Amanda Knox.
Do you want to hear about Amanda Knox?
Yes, we do.
Okay, so Amanda Knox, everybody here knows who she is, I guess, right? So I went to Italy in 2009 with a book contract. My idea was to go over there and write about why this American girl turned into Charles Manson, because that's what I'd been reading as I was consuming information at People magazine, reading the British tabloids, reading what our reporters over there were reporting based on what was being reported in the Italian media and their interviews with the lawyers. I went over. I got there, right in the beginning of the summer, and the trial had already started. It was sort of in play, but in Italy, if everybody knows that you must take your 6-week vacation in the summer. So the whole thing went on hiatus, and that allowed me in those 6 weeks to start interviewing everybody who was around. The prosecutor made himself available, some of the cops, some of the people who were involved in the investigation, all the lawyers. And I'm just doing journalism 101. I was just doing, knock on the door, let's see the document, tell me where this piece of information that I read comes from in the document. You, Mr. Prosecutor, do you back up this piece of information that's in now the British tabloid? And nothing was adding up. In the first couple of weeks, I realized, uh-oh, I got a problem. And I called the editor and I said, I don't know what you want me to do here, but I don't know I no longer think that the book is about a girl who went and turned into Charles Manson. I don't know what it is. I don't know whether she did it or not. I'm now completely confused. And so, I stayed and I had an assistant and we started just doing journalism 101. We went up and down Italy to all these different sources, people who knew the different players. And meanwhile, the trial played out and she was convicted in, a courtroom with the Madonna peeling from the wall behind it's a medieval courtroom, and there was the cross and the church, and they had been calling her Lucifer, and the whole book really should be an opera, not a TV show. It ended. The conviction was called. The press was called in at mezzanotte, at midnight. Come in at midnight and it was November, and there was fog snaking through the piazza, and there were people out in the darkness, and you could hear them howling, Assassina Americana, American killer. And, we went in, and she was condemned, and that's the word they used, condemned. She was convicted. And I walked out thinking, wow, I've just witnessed an actual modern-day pagan scapegoating ritual. Then it was amazing, and so and I learned a lot through that case about how you can take somebody's story in our business and turn them, completely create a character out of bits and pieces of information that are not in Italy. They do journalism differently. They have mafia problems. Their legal system works differently because of the mafia, so it's not as transparent as ours. And so anyway, that's the long answer to your question. I did learn a lot about how the media can be manipulated, and also if you're young, female, and attractive, the things that the press likes to do with that, especially the British tabloids. And, you know, I'm an English major. I'm an Anglophile. I loved the British press. When I would go over there, I loved to read they had, you know, 15 or 20 papers that you could still buy, at least last time I was there. I loved all that. You know, it's the home of the English language. But watching the way these guys worked, there was so much cynicism, I kind of lost a lot of respect for them. So, but it's still a great language.
If it's all right, let's stay away from Trump one more time before we get back to Rick in the belly of the beast. David, I'd love for you to talk about the New York Times and the genesis of the Me Too movement and how the sensitive topics or issues you have to deal with in writing about that.
It kind of came out of the blue for me in that I received a message from Bill O'Reilly's lawyer asking to come over and talk, and I had no idea what he wanted to talk about, and he showed up, and he told me that the Times was working on a story about Bill, and I got in touch with the reporter, and that was really the first time that I had been aware that this line of reporting was taking place. Those stories were incredible by Emily Steele and Mike Schmidt. They represented really hard reporting. A lot of those cases involving Bill O'Reilly involved settlement agreements and getting at people who had agreed not to talk about them and getting behind those settlement agreements. That led roughly the same time to the work that Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey did on Harvey Weinstein. In the book, I talk about, again, always a little slow. That's sort of my motto. I'm at the airport, and I remember Jodi's looking for me, and I called Jodi back, and she said she's going to do this story about Harvey Weinstein, and we're sure to get sued and all that. And I remember thinking, I've seen this movie before. We'll do a story. They'll deny it. Everything will continue on. Maybe some ads will be pulled. The ads will come back. It will be nothing. I was so wrong. And the thing I remembered, and it goes back to a little bit about what I was saying earlier, is that need to stand up, to stay with the story. And Megan and Jodi were incredible. They did not get intimidated. They kept pushing. They were an inspiration to me, and I was not going to be the one to get nervous about it. There was a team of lawyers that Harvey Weinstein ended up with. They were, as it proved, less team than mutually repellent particles, because they then started pushing each other away and then contradicting each other. And so much of what followed in the aftermath was interesting, because there were so many stories after that, and rightfully so. But that lawyers would call me for a person in the art industry, or a person in the music industry, or a person in some other industry, and I could almost script the opening line, and it always was, "My guy's not Harvey Weinstein." And I always thought to myself, and I try to listen, because that's an important part of what I do, that's not really the bar.
You know, for any of you who watched the movie The Post, or reporters are cantankerous, obstreperous, but the lawyers at the Washington Post and the New York Times, the reporters love them, because the lawyers are really on their side, and that movie sort of made it look a little bit like the lawyers were trying to stop everything in the Pentagon Papers. Not quite accurate, and certainly not the norm. And so David and Bo Jones, who I worked at the Post for a long time, you know, their role was to help us get it in the paper, and they believed in that deeply. And so I want to thank David here for all of that you've done over the years. Rick, if you don't mind taking us back to the dirty world of today. I'm curious how much of the cult is a fake cult? In other words, you probably get calls every day from...
Absolutely.
Yeah, talk about that.
So I'm going to divide it out into two big groups. The first group are elected officials. I'm going to tell you a dirty little secret about the Republican Party in the Senate. There are about 10 guys in the Senate who are actual Trump true believers. The cuckoos, the bomb vest guys, I call them. 10. The rest of them fall into the category of either being terrified of Donald Trump, they don't want him to tweet about them, they don't want him to mess up their primary, they just want to go along to get along, get things done. And there's a handful that are just absurd opportunists. I mean, Lindsey Graham is the king of that particular mountain. And Lindsey said the quiet part loud this week in an interview. He goes, I want to be relevant. I want phone calls from the president. I want, if you're not here to have the president love you, why are you here? If you're not going to get reelected, why are you here? Well, I don't know, call me crazy, but something about serving the people of your state or your district seems to, at some point, might have been the intention of the founders. I'm not really clear on that. But that opportunist faction is the thing that normalized Trump and that excuses all of his behavior. Well, we got to get our judges. Well, we got to get this tax cut. Well, we got to get this. We got to get that. Because they have a sense that we're at the party before the apocalypse. And 2018 was a preview. And the scenario that Mitch McConnell faces in 2020 is that's the bad year for the Republicans. Okay, we only had 8 vulnerable seats up this time. Okay, it was the Democrats on defense in 2018. It's the Republicans on defense in 2020. And if the economy isn't where it was in 2018, and Donald Trump's, his numbers, they play in a range somewhere in the very high 30s to very low to mid 40s. That's his trading range. It doesn't vary. That's right now with an economy that everyone considers to be pretty spectacular. Now, why it's spectacular is the Fed and everything else, but we'll leave that aside. If it's not there, these guys are going to have to own Donald Trump, and they're going to have to carry Donald Trump on their back like a big orange weight. And they're not. So the ones that are scared of a primary, they keep their mouth shut because they're afraid Donald Trump will tweet about them and draw the crazies out of the woodwork. I mean, look, Martha McSally lost this race because she was afraid of Kelly Ward, because she was afraid of Donald Trump getting behind Kelly Ward. And if your party is designed to control you by fear of the crazies, it has a whole set of boundaries of getting elected in the general. And you're going to see that iterate out over a lot of races this year. I mean, Lindsey Graham is afraid of Donald Trump saying, I don't like Lindsey Graham, I prefer candidate X. And a single tweet can do it. I mean, you saw in the state of Florida a guy named Adam Putnam, who had been agriculture commissioner, traditional Republican, enormously popular across the state, good dude, like just, taking care of business kind of guy. Donald Trump tweeted about Ron DeSantis, who loved him and who pledged loyalty to him, and Adam Putnam disappeared politically, nuked, gone, over. Donald Trump has enormous power over the Republican base, so these guys are constrained and controlled by that. Now, to break out of the political space, and in the House, basically the sane Republicans either quit or got beat last time around. You were down to the core now. You were down to the Trump-Hottie caucus. And a lot of these guys are very, very committed to preserving the reality bubble around themselves. And you've got Meadows, and you've got Nunes, and you've got Jordan and these guys who are out there basically saying, no, the real crime is in the people that are investigating the crime. Wait. What? But in the Trump, in the social base, in the normal civilian non-elected base, there's a tribal set of the Republican Party that are 25% of these people, 25% of the GOP are ideologically malleable. They are completely in the Trump cult. They care about Donald Trump. If he said tomorrow that the fundamental principle of conservatism is the seizure of property for the working people, they would go, oh yeah, well that's of course what it is. If he spouted Karl Marx tomorrow morning, they would say, well that's conservatism. That's what Buckley said, right? So about 25% of the GOP is just, they're lost. They're gone. They are only about the Trumps. They're going to vote for Donald Trump Jr. for president in 2024. I promise you. They've become a cult-driven, family-driven thing. They want a Trump royal family. We've seen him in focus groups, and it is utterly terrifying because they believe everything he says. Well, he's the richest man in the world. He's the most successful businessman in American history. He's a genius. He's the best negotiator of all time. He's already broken China's back, and all of our money's coming back. They believe these things, and you can't change their mind. They're gone. They're done. It's over. About 25% of the party are behavioral Republicans. They just voted Republican. They're not highly politically engaged. They don't particularly love the Democratic Party. They are social and fiscal conservatives in varying flavors and varying overlapping Venn diagrams. And about 25% of the party is gone, and that primarily were educated voters and female voters. And I like to say that women voters got separated from the GOP in 2016, and in 2018 they got a divorce. And by 2020, I think we're going to have restraining orders. But how do you build a party that's viable nationally, that is dedicated to a platform that is fundamentally anti-immigrant, that is fundamentally alienated Hispanics and African Americans, and just Trump or his people trotting out the occasional person to say, well, a black person works for the administration here, or I have a black friend there. And literally Donald Trump said that. Look at our black friend in one of these rallies. And my jaw was on the floor. That's not exactly Ed Brooke. This isn't exactly, a meaningful leadership in those communities. And the things he said and done, like Charlottesville, those alienation forces are driving people out of the GOP rather quickly. They're also foreclosing a lot of younger voters who have and look, it's the unicorn of politics that younger voters are going to turn out in huge numbers. They don't. They never will. They went up dramatically from 11% to 13% turnout in 2018. But those people are setting a pattern of voter behavior that, if it carries on and if it iterates further, will be a very bad piece of business for the Republican Party. And at some point, this urban-rural divide in the party is going to be a real question mark. And about 25%, to loop back and close this up, of the Republican Party, they dislike Donald Trump. They're not comfortable with him. They are stuck. They don't know what to do. They don't like him. They wish he wasn't president. They like their congressman, or they like their senator, or they like their Republican governor. They don't really like Donald Trump. They're uncomfortable with his affect, with his behavior, with his insults, with his venality, with his vulgarity, with the entire catalog of things that make Donald Trump, a combination of a figure of ridicule and a figure of disgust by a lot of Americans. All that taken as a big whole doesn't mean that the Democrats are going to sweep 2020, because they can snatch victory away from themselves at any given moment. But I think you've got a Republican Party that's in very great flux right now. And it's, the control of Trump over this party is a control of fear for the most part. The FOMT, fear of mean tweets. Always predict how a Republican elected official will behave by that acronym, fear of mean tweets. If they think Trump's going to tweet about them, they will go out and wear a clown suit and break dance in public if that's what they think he wants them to do. So.
We have about 12 minutes left, so people who have questions, come up to the microphones. In the meantime, I want to ask Nina another question. This week we watched Ivanka Trump, without blinking, state on national television that it was just normal clearance procedures for she and Jared. Is that sort of in keeping with the understanding that you have of Ivanka, that she could do that?
Do you want me to read that quote again? Does everybody
please.
remember it? Okay. It's probably perception is more important than reality. If someone perceives something to be true, it is more important than if it is in fact true. This doesn't mean you should be duplicitous or deceitful, but don't go out of your way to correct a false assumption if it plays to your advantage. That's what's going on there, and it'll go on forever. I just want to say, while you're lining people up, that this one thing I learned, one of the insights in my book that I hope everybody goes out and buys it, because they don't want you to read it, is the title "Golden Handcuffs," which I didn't come up with, has to do with obviously we can't leave because our jobs are we get so much money, right? But it's also what I came to understand about Trump is that all of his relationships, and I think Rick's book is sort of has to do with this, is all of the relationships that he has, from the doorman to the journalist to Michael Cohen to the Congress people, is every relationship has an implied threat of blackmail or financial taking your money away. All of them, every single one. And that's why you could see Matt Gaetz doing the tweet the other day threatening Michael Cohen with revealing the mistress. And underlying all that this comes back to journalism, is that one of the reasons Trump can use the word fake news, and I think he believes in it really, is that his entire relationship with the media in New York has been colored by his relationship with David Pecker and his ability to buy stories. Always. He's always been buying stories through the National Enquirer, and that ability, if you do that, if that's what your business model is with journalism, then he looks at me and he looks at the New York Times and he thinks we all have a price and somebody has paid us and we've agreed to that, to take the money. Or, they know something about you. It's blackmail or it's cash.
So we don't have too much time, so let's make these lightning round answers. All right? We'll start here.
Given everything that's going on and has been going on, could each of you tell me why Donald Trump will not be impeached by the House?
They don't have the votes in the Senate. It's never going to happen.
By the House?
It doesn't matter. Why take the vote if you can't close the deal?
What he said.
Yep.
What he said.
We all agree on that.
0% chance.
So, the beginning of this talk, just to reveal a conflict of interest, I'm a reporter, so I'm really interested in what people think of the press, was the statement that everybody seemed to agree on, is that the public doesn't trust the media, and the distrust has grown, so by Fox News, by Trump, whatever. So my question is there any kind of an even mild fix for this? Because all I ever hear as a reporter is, just keep doing your job, just do your job, file your Freedom of Information Act requests. Is there a fix for this problem, or is it just going to keep getting worse?
I answered that to you the other day, so I'll let David and Nina.
What was your answer? Oh, no.
What he said, keep doing your job.
Yeah, I mean, as unsatisfying as that is, I think that's the role of reporters. I think the role of a lot of us who are not reporters but love what they do, that is what journalists do, we have to be the ones speaking up for it. I think we have to stand up against libel suits. I think we have to stand up against any attempts to change the law. But I really think that it depends on that same group that Rick's been talking about to come out and say this is unacceptable. The people in the Republican Party to say, I may not like the New York Times, but you know what? They are not the purveyors of fake news. They are not the enemy of the people. They're not a stain on society. We need a free press.
Yeah, I mean, I second that. I just think, the basis of what I do has to do with speaking truth to power, and that is the bedrock of our country. And everybody in this room should go out and share that notion with their friends and who think that that's not what the media is or the press is. Even if it's media that's doing ridiculous things, they should be allowed to speak and to say what they want. That's what this country was founded on.
Yes.
This is for Mr. Wilson. Given your peculiar knowledge of Republicans, can you tell us if anybody is likely to stand up with a backbone, either in the communitarian class or the senators?
I think you will see a couple of Republicans who primary Donald Trump. As of this moment, that's still an open question of whether any of this is going to be an effective primary. But there's a historical precedent here that's a fairly recent vintage, which is Pat Buchanan, who had no chance whatsoever of beating George H.W. Bush in 1992, primaried him. He was an absolute, edge case, 0% chance, but he drew a lot of blood into the water. He churned the water up enough that the shark of Ross Perot came along to nip and break off votes from Bush in the general election, and basically empowered some of the populism of that time to flood out of the GOP into the independent side and enabled Clinton to win.
I'm actually going to interview Kasich next week. Do you think he's going to get in or not?
I think John wants to get in. I don't know if he sees the timing window working for him.
Thank you.
I had sort of two elements to my question, and one of them is I was thinking about the book by Jane Meyer about dark money and the look of the evolution of the powers that be behind how we got to Trump, in a sense, but also looking at what you were talking about earlier in terms of the consolidation of, or the reduction of number of journalists out there. And I'm a former journalist myself, and I wanted to look at that from the perspective of a paper that I worked at over 25 years ago that had, at one point, a small town, 45,000 people, had 25 reporters. It has 1 reporter now. At all. So the confluence of that money that's coming in on that level of political discourse, and yet we have fewer and fewer journalists and more media consolidation and ownership of that consolidation, meaning fewer viewpoints being proposed. Have at it.
I think David's probably.
The situation, Nina's absolutely right. The situation in local journalism is really dire. But I would like to talk about a couple of things which I think are positive. One is that I think that the new nonprofit model is starting to take hold. There are people with money who are financing nonprofit local journalism
Texas
sites.
Tribune, for
Texas
instance,
Tribune,
yeah.
for instance. You're going to see that. I have been talking to people about forming a nonprofit law firm, getting nonprofit legal services to those. I think that's going to help a lot. The second thing is that the New York Times has succeeded with a model which I hope will catch on, and that is our revenue base has shifted dramatically to subscribers rather than advertisers. I don't think the local advertising market is coming back. It's not going to happen. The internet has made that impossible. But if a lot of good folks like you are willing to pay for news, be the subscription base for local news, there's some hope.
I just want to say that our byword is benevolent billionaire. And I don't think the WAPO actually would be where it is if it hadn't been purchased. You're talking about the success of the great national press in Washington. It's due to somebody coming in and pouring money into it and not expecting to get a lot of money back.
There's we could do a whole separate talk on the consolidation of media firms in the last 25 years and why that led here, and why the tyranny of a quarterly report has led these guys to cut and cut and cut and cut and cut, and the belief that the power of for their stockholders is the only thing that matters in the equation, is sort of runs head to head with some of the necessities of journalism.
Benevolent was the key word, because there are some
Right.
billionaires who are just
Exactly.
cutting the hell out of
Yes.
newspapers.
Yeah.
But I would say for my own paper, the Washington Post, Donald Graham, who grew up in the newspaper, it was his family newspaper, who loved it, read it every day, read every story in the paper every day. It was an act of incredible selflessness for him to sell the paper to Jeff Bezos, who so far has been benevolent.
Can I just ask a quick question? So there's a Facebook meme going around that says, as a journalist, if somebody tells you the sun is shining, it is not your job to bring in somebody else who says it's raining outside. It's your job to open the window, put your head outside, and tell us what's really happening. And I wonder how you all give me much more hope than the actual media that I read or listen to gives me. And so I wonder, what is the interplay between sort of presenting the whole spectrum of craziness that's out there that actually starts at about the center and moves so far to the right that it's ridiculous, and the whole left is just sort of not even there. The balancing act, I guess, and then what you were talking about, and both of you were talking about just standing up and speaking truth to power and saying, no, that's BS, and that's not the story we're going to tell. We're going to tell the truth.
Well, as a working journalist, that's been an issue that's been discussed since I got into the business 30 years ago. It's always a problem and a question. People are, why do you want to talk to the crazy gorilla over there? If the guy said, the earth is flat, you have to go test that out. But that's what we do, and I think I think now the press has moved against Trump so far that that's actually problematic in some ways, that there is that there's a resistance because people can see it. That's one problem. But the other thing is, just don't get your information from Facebook. That's please
Right.
don't even do it
Right.
ever.
The oldest saying in journalism is a city editor saying, "If your mother says she loves you, check it out." So it's
As Benjamin Franklin said, this Facebook meme is excellent.
So anyway, thank you to this wonderful panel, and thank you all for coming today.